Hi divers, vintage divers. Alec Peirce here, Scuba, Alec Peirce Scuba, and this is another Vintage Scuba episode. And I hope that what I have to show you today is a little bit interesting. You know, when you walk into a dive store today and you walk around, you look at the mask and all that kind of neat stuff, and usually someplace around the store you'll find a catalog. A catalog, you know what I mean by a catalog? Your catalog's got scuba gear in it, you know? And you can flip through it and see all the neat stuff that's for sale. In fact, at one time there used to be maybe a half a dozen catalogs. Now, you may have noticed the last few years that there are fewer and fewer catalogs available. Sure, we have the internet. So what'll happen is if you say to the store owners, did you have a catalog of your gear? The store owner will say, well, no, if you just go to the internet and what you're looking for. And you say, well, I'd be interested in seeing what Scuba Pro has done. Well, just go to scubapro.com. And it's quite true, and that's what you do. You know, it's too bad because catalogs were a lot of fun. You could pick up the catalog and it was a book and it had pictures and it was glossy. It had the equipment and a description. You could flip through it and you could open it up and leave it somewhere and come back to it later. Anyway, I miss catalogs, but catalogs are pretty neat. And catalogs from you know, they've been around since the 20s and 30s. That's right, over almost 100 years. Catalogs. It's only been the last 2 or 3 years with the surge of the internet. Every company has a web page. The catalogs are slowly but surely disappearing. And the same applies to Scuba catalogs. So what I want to do, I'm going to do this in a couple of different episodes, not just in one. This is the first one, but you watch. If this is of interest to you, you watch. And you'll see that we're going to do, Kevin and I are going to do a couple of vintage Scuba catalogs. Now, right now, I'm going to do catalogs from the 50s, from the 1950s, yes. I would like to do catalogs from the 1940s, but there aren't any. There aren't any. There really, it's not that I don't have them, just there aren't any. Yes, exactly right. The sport didn't really become recognized as a sport. And even then, it wasn't recognized as a sport in the 50s. It was recognized as an activity that some people would do. And, but it wasn't, people didn't think it would catch on as a sport. Like guys and girls and kids and families would travel and go scuba diving. Yeah, right. Not a chance. That's dangerous. Eh? And so the companies didn't invest a lot of money. And scuba equipment, first of all, there wasn't much. If there had been a catalog in the 40s, it'd be a single sheet of 8.5 by 11, maybe both sides. The whole catalog, you see. So it wasn't until about the 50s that some of the companies started to have enough equipment that they needed to make some pictures and a list of it to show to people. We call that a catalog. As a matter of fact, the very first catalog that came out, the first recognized catalog that came out as a catalog with pictures of equipment and description was 1954. And that catalog, it was brought out by U.S. divers, a fairly new company, well, a very new company actually, called U.S. Divers. And it was an interesting bit of a story. I'll just share this with you. But before I do that, what I wanted to do is give you a sort of a teaser as to what I'll be doing over these other episodes in catalogs. You see, there are a lot of companies that you folks may not even recognize. I have a whole series of catalogs from Healthways. Healthways was one of the biggest companies ever, equal in size to U.S. Divers at the time in the 50s and 60s. New England Divers, you may have heard of some of these, but probably not. New England Divers again. Parkway, big company. Divers Supply. Seamless. There's a pretty girl in the front of the Seamless catalog. White Stag. Now, White Stag was a very big company as well. Big company, White Stag. There's a catalog from 1971. Aqua Craft. Here's one you probably had never heard of. You folks who live up in Aurora, Ohio. You may or may not know, but if you live anywhere near Aurora, there was a very well-known company up there called Rose Aviation. They were actually in aviation, but they also produced scuba regulators. And not too many, and they only made a few, and they were pretty neat, pretty weird and neat. And I have those regulators. They had a catalog. Seacraft, Nemrod, Sportsways, big company again in L.A. This was started and owned by a very close friend of mine, Sam Lecoq, and a great idea. Decor. Decor was one of the best-known companies ever. And this was actually Diving Accessories Corporation, where the name came from. If you're wondering where what's Decor? Now you know. And this was based in Illinois, Northfield, Illinois. and big company, wonderful equipment, and unfortunately they closed up not too long ago. Swim Master, another one else we got. Viking, there's a company called Viking. Dive Master, there's a good name for a company. Dive Master, and they had a series of catalogs. Central Skin Divers, big and new. Berry Scuba, berry, just like berry, like raspberry, Berry Scuba. Bel Air, all these little catalogs are from all these different companies. So there's a lot of really, and I have more, a lot of really interesting companies, catalogs, and history that I can share with you about the early days of scuba diving. What I want to do today, though, is talk about those very first ones, the very oldest ones, back in the 50s. As I mentioned a moment ago, the very first catalog came from U.S. divers, and it came in 1954. Now, it's interesting because the very first catalogs were actually not catalogs, not really what we would call a catalog. When you pick up a catalog today, in the last few years, you pick it up and you expect to see the pretty picture on the front. Well, it didn't have very many pretty pictures. Remember, there was no underwater photography. There was darn little color photography. There's your pretty picture. And then you would open it up and you'd expect to see some pictures of equipment in there, and maybe some underwater pictures as well. Well, this is an example of early catalogs. Now, let me explain why. This particular one I'm looking at right here is automatic reserve, regulators, harnesses, mouthpieces, accessories that you would use. And here it talks about underwater pressure, about going down, how your airspace is squeezed, and how you have to breathe as you're going up and down. This is a catalog. And how to use the proper weights and regulating your buoyancy. This sounds more like a textbook, doesn't it? It sounds like a learn how to scuba dive. That's what it was. There were no textbooks in the 50s. So the one or two or three scuba companies that had scuba equipment, and they were hoping to start a company, start a business to sell scuba equipment, they had to explain to people, first of all, how to scuba dive. They had to also explain to them how to be safe while scuba diving. And then in the process of doing that, you see, as they were explaining, okay, this is what you do, you're very safe, make sure you do that. In the process of doing that, eventually they would get around to showing them the products that they had for sale. And there weren't very many of them, but they would explain about the products that they had for sale. So it was a kind of a textbook catalog. It told people how to go scuba diving, and it showed the equipment. Now, this particular one, called Diving with the Aqua Lung, is written by a chap by the name of René Bouzeau. A little bit of history. René Bouzeau was a French-Canadian, as a matter of fact. And he had contacts in France. And as you know, the very first Aqua Lung, we'll call it the Aqua Lung, the very first regulator, underwater breathing device, was produced in France. And he had contacts there, and he said, gosh, this is pretty neat. I think I can sell this stuff. So he was based in Montreal in Canada, and he imported or brought over from France some of these regulators, René Bouzeau. And he started to sell them. Did pretty well, but not well enough. Pretty soon he realized that this isn't going to work here in Canada. It's just not a big enough market in Canada. So he moved to the United States. He went to LA, as a matter of fact. And he started a company called United States Divers. We call it U.S. Divers today. And it wasn't very long. I'm going to show you something. Diving with the Aqua Lung. You see it there? By René Bouzeau. Now look at this one. Diving with the Aqua Lung. U.S. Divers. 2 years later. Pictures on the back, black and white pictures on the back. And if you open up and take a look at the inside, you'll see it's the same type of thing. The first steps, what to buy, how to take care of it, how to be careful to breathe in and out. And of course, in the process of doing that, they would introduce the equipment that they had for sale. Tanks, regulators, and so on. So it was a textbook catalog. And then eventually, textbooks became available, and so they were able to change and have real catalogs. I'm going to show you that first catalog. This is a very rare piece of literature. Not too many of these in existence, and very few in existence that are in absolutely pristine shape. This is 1954, Diving, from U.S. Divers. This is their very first catalog that was widely available. And this particular one that I have in my hands is original. and it is in exactly the same condition that it would be if you had picked it up in the dive store this morning. Now you'll notice that when we open it up a little bit, I need to be careful with this, all right? If you don't mind, I'm going to be very slow and careful with this. You see, you open it up, and the first couple of pages are text. It talks about diving, what you can do, what you can't do. But very quickly, it begins with pictures and explanations of the equipment. So there you go with the Aquamaster regulator. Now that is the regulator. You want to buy a regulator? There it is. You know, today when you go into a dive store, there's dozens and dozens of regulators. 6 or 7 or 8 different companies represented, and they all have 8 or 9 or 10 regulators. Well, 1954, there's the regulator. You want to be a diver? That's the one you buy. They did have different types of tanks available, and those tanks had different valves on them. This is the catalog, by the way, that established the J valve, the K valve, and the R valve. There were so few products that rather than give these particular items individual, long, like today, bar-coded or 16, 17-digit product numbers, it was simple. They gave them a letter from the alphabet. That's right. So when someone says to you, well, why is it called a J valve? Well, it is not because it looks like a J. I don't care how much you twist your eyes and hold it up to the light, it doesn't look like a J. It's called a J valve because in the catalog, it was the J item. The item just before the K item. The K item, as it happens to be, was another valve. It was the valve without the reserve. It was called the K valve. So in 1954, if you were a dive store owner, there were probably a half a dozen in all the United States, and you wanted to order some valves from U.S. divers to sell in your dive store, you would call up and you would say, yes, I think I want to have 6 of those K valves, and send me 2 of the J valves with the reserve too. I think I can talk divers in. So that's where those designations came from. K valve and J valve. They came from the catalog number. The catalog number was actually a letter. And we can go on through here. You can see spear guns. Big part of the sport in the 50s. Spear guns in the catalog. Wetsuits and dry suits. Yeah, they had dry suits back then. Yeah. They were rubber. They were like latex rubber. It was like putting on a latex glove. Not like the dry suits of today. There are no valves and no inflation or anything. It was just rubber suit, and you wore long, thick, woolly underwear underneath them to keep warm. And of course, they had masks, lots of masks with snorkels. They had some pretty weird-looking masks. I don't know if you see that, Kevin. Can you see that mask with a snorkel coming out of the top? They were pretty weird. And fins, of course. I had to have a fin. There weren't too many fins available. I don't even see any fins in here. I know there are some. I don't see any fins, though. Goodness, hang on a second there, Kevin. I must have skipped that page. They had fins somewhere. Oh, not in this catalog. Must be a different catalog. Gauges. They had a couple of little gauges. There's some. Oh, there's the fins there. I'm sorry. This is the last 2 pages. There's one page has some underwater camera housings made of plastic, glued together plastic. Whoops. And then there's the fins there, the 2 or 3 fins that they had available. So that's a typical catalog. In fact, it is the catalog from 1954. Black and white, or black and blue. Not a whole lot of choice. That's what you had. Pretty neat, huh? And then the next year, there's 1955, almost exactly the same catalog. The first couple of pages were explanation on how to dive safely. The one and only Aqua Lung. They talk about the one and only Aqua Lung. Oh yeah, marketing was alive and well in the 50s. And they still had the regulator and the cylinder valves and all the other bits and pieces. Here's 1956. 1956 is not quite as good a shape. 1956, how old is that, Kevin? 67 years. 61 years. These catalogs are 61 years old. In 1956, whoa, look at that. You had 3 regulators to choose from. Wow. Actually, you didn't. They were almost identical. They put different hoses and different mouthpieces on them. I just noticed something on here, Kevin. Can you get in here nice? Oh, no, they wouldn't. I don't think they understand that about the one-piece hoses. These are double hoses, but it's really only one hose. Can you get in really close to this? I'll hold it still. Can you see those hoses on those regulators? You folks that are into 2-hose regulators. These are 2-hose regulators, right? No, they're not. These are 1-hose regulators. It's one hose that comes from the intake port around to the mouthpiece and keeps on going right around to the exhaust. One hose. No non-return valves. Boy, don't take this out of your mouth. It fills with water, really hard to clear. Anyway, there you go. 1954 to 1956. And then all of a sudden they said, hey, this is going great. Products are good, sports catching on. There's 6 new dive stores in California since we started. We got lots more products. We're bringing in lots of stuff now. So this is 1957. Now this is a year after this catalog. Hard to believe. There's this catalog, black and white pretty much, or blue and white. Now look, whoa, on the front page, 1957, U.S. Divers Catalog. And there's a foreword, of course, by the big guy himself. And then on we go. Color picture on the inside. I'm not sure how they did that. And oh, look at the regulators now. Oh, there's a single hose regulator. There you go, folks. There's definitive proof. The first single hose regulator from U.S. Divers came out in 1957. There you go. There's your proof. This is how we often, the guys in the vintage community, how we find out about the history of equipment using catalogs. When did it first come out? Tanks. Lots of lights now, lots of gauges. There was only 1 gauge in that first catalog. Now there's a whole bunch of them. There's a dive light in there, and compressors for sale, and valves, and all kinds. There's wetsuits and dry suits still, and still lots of spear guns. Oh yeah, spear guns were a big thing. Let's see if they have any fins in this one. Snorkels and a bunch of knives there, a couple of camera pieces and so on. Any masks in here? There must be some masks in here. Oh, there's the fins. Color on the back. And on it goes. So you see that the first catalogs, as I mentioned, the very, very first ones were more like a textbook that showed divers how to dive safely. And along the way, at the same time, they showed them some equipment that they could buy. 1958, next year, and 59. I don't have 59 here for some reason. And there's 1960, which I can't show to you because this just is for the 50s. But I have lots more. I have U.S. Divers catalogs right up to the present day, and I'm going to show you some more changes as well. So there you go. That's the set of U.S. Diver catalogs from the 50s, the very first catalogs ever made, in particular this particular one. So I hope this has been interesting. You've learned a lot of things. First of all, how the first catalogs were flimsy little things, 3 or 4 or 5 pages, no color, and they were really textbooks. They taught the prospective scuba diver how to dive because you couldn't go to Google. It didn't work. How to dive. You couldn't do that. There was no place to learn how to scuba dive. The odd dive shop was running classes. Mel Fisher had Mel's Aqua Shop in California, and a few other people that I know, but not too many. So the first books to come out from the scuba companies were like a little textbook with information in them. And then eventually they started to put the gear in there. And you also learned a little bit about J valves and K valves. They still use that terminology today, 50, 60 years later. And people say, why is it called a J valve? Well, if you twist it sideways and squint, listen, no. It's because there were so few products that each product had a letter. And so they became known as J valves, K valves. And there was another valve as well called the R valve. Maybe we'll talk about that valve someday. It was a little bit different. Anyway, I hope that was of some interest to you. Maybe to create some comments and some questions for you. I do have these catalogs, and they're pretty neat. If you have some specific questions about something, you give me a call. Alec Peirce, Vintage Scuba. I hope you enjoyed that. Talk to you real soon.